Texture is everything. From real-world artists to actual textures applied to a surface in games, texture creates a feeling. When you design a tabletop map, it is important to understand different methods to convey texture. Because again, texture creates a feeling. It's a feeling for the players to latch onto for all of their senses. This is Jesse from The Dark Science, and in this video, I'll be going over how I approach texturing my own maps, maybe some methods you might employ, as well as comparing some of the maps that you might be familiar with from other tabletop map artists. Let's just begin with what is texture? Texture is the pattern you create to differentiate objects within a scene. The scene you are trying to depict might inform the texture you would want to use. Scenes I want to share with my maps are often of imperfect nature. And what I mean by that is, if I were to draw spaceships, they would most likely look like something out of Star Wars rather than a 1960s UFO. But this goes far beyond just simply a visual decision. That texture is what changes everything. We could doodle a UFO, or we can intensely detail a UFO. The style in which you decide to choose that detail, hence the imperfect nature I strive for, will change the way that your players view it. It's not just what does this surface feel like, it's what does this surface make me feel like. When it comes to maps, we have only so much space to deal with, especially for all the homies who are still sporting math grid paper. There's only so much detail that we can pack into that square. This is where different pen sizes and different pressure strokes come in. If you draw physically, I recommend getting a pack of micron pens that vary in size. If you draw on Procreate like me or some other digital program, make sure to have different brush sizes available, or at least a brush that changes width the more you press down on it. I like to use extremely light brush strokes because I opt for the implication of texture. This is a creative decision to help fill in the gaps of how much detail is present in a scene. It is also a method used in traditional art. The more detailed objects are what the artist wants you to focus on, while the least detailed ones are for background assumptions. Your mind will fill it in. Take, for example, this grass. We could detail it even more, or we can go ahead and leave it up to your mind to fill in that gap. Putting too much texture and attention into the grass over everything else, the viewer's attention will be drawn to the grass instead of what else you might be trying to get them to look at. Your choice of hyper detail, implication of detail, lack of detail, and more will really help selling the mood of your map by morphing and forming the textures. It becomes your art style. Here I am working on the painted world of Aramis from Dark Souls. It's a dilapidated fortress monastery in the snowy mountain Alps, which you'll be able to find on my Patreon later this month when it is fully finished. Everything here is subject to the elements at full display, and the decay of this world should be reflected in those pen strokes. I begin with lightly outlining my walls to give me my bounds. Then I start with the floor and observe the texture I'm trying to emulate. Filthy and dirty. The first thing that leaves a hollow's mind is clearly the desire to remove the clothes pile from their chair. Soon after comes the ability to mop, then sweep. It's sad but true. To really sell that effect, we're going to use light strokes that don't mean much. This should be like the LaCroix of texturing, just the faintest hint of flavor. You don't need to draw every single block on the floor. If you do, just do it lightly. You can always come back and emphasize something if it's not to your liking. Pressure always plays a role. If you are using a physical pen, a physical micron pen, you can opt for a really tiny nib, probably something like a 0.3. When you do that, You can go ahead and just lightly stroke versus fully pressing down on it, and you'll notice the weight of that line is different. Lighter lines will be much more scratchy, much more imperfect. It will look less clean. Deliberate, full-bodied strokes that stay the same size, even while you're using different pens for your drawing, will showcase a much more clean look. I personally thrive in this scratchy look. It gives it a very grungy, worn look that I'm going for. I rarely use thicker lines, and if I do, it's to delineate the textures further because of how similar or close they are to another. The usual candidates for this are the walls, and even then, I've been really enjoying keeping the lines quite thin. Next, we're going to go ahead and add some of the snow, getting rid of some of the lines that we currently have. And then lastly, we're going to go ahead and add some of this rubble. And this rubble is really going to sell the fallen, destroyed texture. My goals with this map were it to look grungy, filthy, ruined, and wet. And I feel like these textures are trying to tell that story for my players to latch onto, to feel that and smell that and see it, just to get their senses going by just navigating this map. The last thing that I want to do is just take a look at a few of the other TTRPG cartographer artists. That's a really long title. And how they deal with texture. That way you can use them as an inspiration so you can see how different these line strokes and weight of lines really affect selling a texture. Beginning with dice and logos, all right? These maps, they're very bare bones. All that character comes from their hatching style in the walls. The floors remain uncluttered and have bare minimum detail to apply its surface style. The grid is actually what tells you what is happening. Is this area dirt? Is this area tile? And even then, they're left with minimal detail. But you can tell that these areas are meant to feel worn. Next, we have seppuku, extravagant and elaborate pieces, but they mostly rely on the color to convey the texture. If you actually zoom in, the line work and textures from the line strokes are actually extremely limited or often perfect geometry. The color, shading, and lighting is what transforms the textures on this map. The lines just serve as this guiding purpose for the artist and for you to utilize, all while the color does the texture work. Next, we have 2-minute tabletop. Extremely grungy, charming, and cartooning. Rust creates textures through imperfect strokes of real ink, complemented with digital coloring to add that additional layer. Just look at this grass. That texture comes from the colors versus just the grass brush strokes. You can make a combination of different textures this way. Lastly, we have JP Kuvert, and he does this minimal cartoon-like strokes. They're almost doodle-like, and they conveyed the mood and tones of an adventure that is supposed to be a fun romp over everything else. Detail, when it is added, is often added with single dots or strokes. Those single dots and strokes convey so much in the way that he draws. You can just tell that it's supposed to be just a bit dingy, just a bit worn. And there are so many more wonderful map artists around, and that was only the most bare-bone dive into the way that these artists utilize lines as textures. Everyone has so many different methods they use, and they are all used to cultivate their own art style or even modify it. Take a look at these two maps that I made, and you can see how the way that I did textures on the floor changed to how they do them now. You can see how I was only putting texture around the walls and around certain objects, but as it got more towards the open space, I left it open with just a couple hits here and there. Now I do the entire floor, but extremely lightly, with very, very thin strokes. Your style will evolve just like mine did and everyone else's. And I hope that you're able to go through the map creation process, trusting it in seeing that map through till the end. Lastly, I just want to thank my patrons, starting with the Arcane Archivist, David Doyle. On to the next are the Dark Delvers, Benjamin Runyon, Daijobu, Dark Sun Rebel, Hayden Martin, James Albiston, Legendary Zero, Press Mindless, and Samuel Day. And finally, here are all of the Secret Seekers. I hope that everyone has enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found it useful in some way to help you make these maps. I'll see you next time.